Welcome to the 64 Squares studio, where chess history comes to life, one classical battle at the time. Hope you're having a great day so far. And today we are going to look at the very recent game which was played like 4 days ago between current world champion Gukesh Dommaraju versus the ex world champion Magnus Carlsen, greatest of all time considered by many. And why I'm covering this game? Well, a lot of people have covered this game, and I have seen a lot of videos on this particular game. And I think a lot of people don't understand how deep this position, the game position gets. It's really tricky, and the way Gukesh has handled the complications after getting the lost position is just phenomenal. It's not every day that Magnus Carlsen didn't able to win +3 positions. So, well, this game is an inspiration, and I think it is the best to dive right into it and dive into a lot of lines, which shows how complex the position gets in this particular game. So, Gukesh is white and Carlsen is black. It was played in Norway Chess 2025, round number 6, and it's a classical round. But the time is really tricky in this games. It's 120 minutes plus 40 second till move 40 for each side, no increment. So e4 by Gukesh, e5 by Magnus, and we have the Berlin defense. Bishop, not bishop c4, sorry, bishop to b5, knight to f6, pawn to d3. So not going into the castle main line of the Berlin, but rather keeping it solid. Bishop to c5, c3. Of course, if you castle, then knight d4, castles, castles. So far, so good. d6, h3, a6. Right, many people play bishop d7, but we have a6, bishop to a4, and h6. Well, rook to e1 is still the main line, but it's kind of strange that Gukesh took 5.5 minutes deciding on rook to e1. So I think Gukesh is already not in his preparation. He is basically remembering his ideas, but he don't know this exact particular position. b5 by Magnus, again with 4.5 minutes of thinking. So it goes on to show probably players are either remembering their lines or they just don't know this position. Bishop to c2, bishop to b6, and knight b to d2 after 13 minutes of thinking. a4 is another idea, and after bishop b7, well, knight d2 is the most played move, and the game continues. But this bishop on b7 looks silly after knight d2. This knight comes to g3 and f5 pretty soon. So that's another way to continue. But knight b d2 directly, keeping the a4 option open. Knight to e7 by black. Standard idea, the knight is going to g6 and a4 by Gukesh now. So Gukesh is clearly hinting that if you play bishop to b7, then after knight to f1, or rather knight to h4, and then this knight goes to g3 to f5, and this bishop is no longer participating. And after 8.5 minutes of thinking, Magnus Carlsen played the first novelty of the position, rook to b8. And believe it or not, it was in this position after move number 14 that we have a completely new game. And pawn to d4 by Gukesh, the best continuation and played pretty quickly actually. The idea is after knight to g6, you have to play knight to, well, Gukesh played knight to f1. A better move would have been to take on b5 and then play knight to f1. You will see what I mean by that. So knight to f1 directly by Gukesh. Pawn to c5 by Magnus. Of course, this position really assembles this bishop on e7 line, the Chigorin variation. But black surprisingly have a very nice bishop on b6. And it's a matter of fact, if the bishop on e7, well, bishop on e7 is generally a defensive piece. So the king has a good defender. And bishop on b6 is an aggressive piece. So it just goes on like, you prefer the aggressive bishop or the passive bishop. But definitely one thing to keep in mind from white side is you don't want to play d5 and allow c4, or rather you don't want to play d5 even after the cd has been played. This bishop becomes a monster if you do that. And this game is a prime example of how Ruy Lopez position can go really bad for white or black rather if you don't trade carefully. So knight to g3 by Gukesh, and this was the last moment where Gukesh could have played 8 takes b, 8 takes b, and then knight to g3. because simply white has better pieces. White has the open file for the rook, white has the nice bishops which are on their original squares, but it is doing their job. Bishop to e3 is my next move, followed by bishop to d3 at some cases, and white is very solid. White got the center, white got the open file, and black still needs to deal with this bishop. It does not have many squares, and this bishop which currently is looking at the pawn. But after Gukesh's knight d3, black played series of brilliant moves in my opinion. First, Magnus took c into d. Took 5.5 minutes for this. C into d by Gukesh. And a brilliant response to this entire position. If white can get into b5 and bishop e3, let's say you play bishop d7 and white gets this position, white is super happy with his position. White is dominant. He will play bishop to d3 next. This pawn is weak and white's center is very stable in the position with these pieces. And you really don't have any play with this bishop. This bishop is staring at white pawns and this bishop is staring at another white pawn, which is well defended. So this is the dream position for white. But Magnus played c b into a4, a very anti-positional move. But what it does, it gains time and it removes the pawn from b5 square. So there is no open a file anymore. And after bishop into a4 and bishop to b7, you can already sense that this bishop looks really good. Now if you play bishop to e3, your e4 pawn is already hanging because there is no bishop on c2. So you have to probably play bishop to c2 in this position and then play bishop to e3 next, and you are still fine. Not as good as the last variation, but still you are doing fine. And this is what Gukesh should have done. But Gukesh, after 23 minutes of thinking, played a positional inaccuracy, pawn to d5, which simply opens up black's bishop, and this bishop is shut down, yes, but you have given up entire pressure in the center and black's pieces are just better now. The only weakness black has is this pawn on d6, and other than that black is fine, and white's e4 pawn is much weaker than the black's d6 pawn. So you will see what happens next. So Magnus played another excellent move, pawn to a5, opening up this diagonal for the bishop because bishop is blocked by this pawn, right? And bishop to e3 by Gukesh. Another, well, bishop to c2 again would have been better. Idea being, if you play, let's say, bishop to a6, then I could perhaps play a b4 and it exchanged the black's weak pawn for white's weak pawn. What idea being, I want to play bishop to a3 and then knight to f5 to hit that weakness. So you always have to trade carefully and keep the opponent's weakness in mind. But Gukesh kinda got careless and played bishop to e3. And excellent move by Magnus again, bishop to c8, hinting at some ideas on h3 square. And also there is a very direct threat of bishop into e3 and rook into b2. Sorry, that b2 pawn is hanging. So b3 makes sense, though a weak move, but it makes sense. Bishop into e3, rook into e3. And after the exchange of dark bishop, yes, black's fantastic bishop is gone, but there's no defender to the f4 square anymore, and knight to f4 directly by Magnus. And probably the only move which I would like to criticize in the Gukesh's play in this entire game. Here Gukesh played bishop to c6, and this is real inaccuracy. This bishop on c6 does literally nothing. It's a pawn. It's rather a weak pawn. It can't even go to c7, so it's not even a pawn. It's really bad piece. And after, well, this move actually allows a direct tactics also. So, well, pause the video and if you like, and try to find what Magnus didn't play in this position while I give you a couple of seconds. Okay, after the 16 minutes of thinking, Magnus played rook to b4. I'm pretty sure on the 16 minutes, Magnus was calculating bishop into h3, which is the right variation. The idea being after g takes, which is probably that's the only move you got, knight into h3, king g2. Knight g4 is not that hard to find for someone at Magnus caliber. if you take the knight, knight f2 forks the queen and the king, and I'm attacking your rook. Sorry, and more importantly, I'm also attacking your pawn on f2. So, well, a lot of things happening, but white's next move is kind of easy to find. Queen to d2, because knight into f2 followed by knight into e3 was the threat. And now there is a problem. Here you have to judge that you don't want to capture the rook. If you capture the rook, then after king into h3, suddenly black knight on e3 is trapped. It cannot go back, it cannot go here anymore. And if you play queen c8 check, I go knight f5, and still this knight here is trapped. So you cannot do that. That is just losing. And you cannot take on f2 either, because rook to e2, and there's no way you can defend rook into f2. So it is a very complex sacrifice where you have to find this particular move, knight f4 check, which again probably something which Magnus might have looked, king f1, and probably this is what Magnus missed, knight into e3 check. And here white has to play queen into e3. If you play pawn into e3, then rook into b3, and suddenly there is a pin, and why black is just winning in this position. But if you play queen into e3, here is the last move you have to find before you, done with your calculation, rook to b4. With queen c8, queen h3 coming up next, black's position is winning with precise play. And with precise defense, white will be able to go to the endgame, but still a losing endgame. Anyway, so that was a very complex bishop into h3 line, which at the end Magnus didn't play. He played rook b4, which still gives the advantage, but not as much. And the problem is here Gukesh played queen to c2. Again with the 6 minutes of thinking. And Magnus again finds the best move in the position, which is g6, a very slow move. You have to realize that any white piece, like all the white pieces, are not moving anywhere. All the white pieces are just stuck at their original position. These knight cannot really go, and you have to constantly be worried about bishop into h3, right? And g6 just stops the knight from coming to f5 to nh5, and h5 h4 is the threat. A very simple but very effective idea. And Gukesh, feeling the pressure, spent 17 minutes and played king to h1. A very sad move, just sidesteps bishop into h3 ideas, because now knight h3 is not a check anymore. But you can already feel that white's position looks really bad. And Magnus' next move, a very nice move, a very nice positional move, makes it even harder, which is bishop to a6. That bishop is no longer serving any purpose on that h3 pawn. So bishop to a6 renews on the new diagonal, and that bishop was the last piece which was not involved in the game. And now all the black pieces are doing something. So queen to a2 by Gukesh. Now this is a weak move, probably a losing move, but there is nothing you can do if you think carefully. If you think about the human approach in this position, then definitely you have no moves at all to play. So queen to a2 is a nice practical try, but it loses on the spot. So pause the video and try to find what Magnus played in this position while I give you a couple of seconds. Okay. Well, Magnus played bishop to a6 with the intentions of going to d3, and queen from c2 was actually defending d3. But now there's no queen on c2, so bishop to d3 is possible, and Magnus played it. Another nice move. You can always, put your money on Magnus to find the best positional moves in the position. And e4 pawn is hanging, so knight to d2 by Gukesh, but a simple h5 with the simplest threat of h4 removing the defender of the e4 pawn and then capturing the pawn. And there is no defense against this particular idea. Gukesh did play queen into a5 after 2.5 minutes of thinking, because they both don't really have much time to play. Magnus does have a little bit more time than Gukesh, and there is no increment till move 40, guys, so keep that in mind. Queen into a5, rook into a5, and pawn to h4. And Gukesh did spend the rest of his time, basically the 6 minute, to find rook to a4. Again, not probably the best move, but I mean, it's a tricky move. If you capture on g3, then after fg3, the e4 pawn, well, sorry, the knight is hanging and the bishop is hanging. So that is something to keep in mind. So after rook to a4, Magnus said, well, I'm not interested in anything. I'm just gonna defend my rook and everything remains the same. All the pressure in white's position is still there. The knight is still hanging. The pawn on e4 is still hanging. The rook is defended. So now all your threats are gone. And Gukesh played rook to a2 after 4.5 minutes of thinking. A very tricky move where you have the opportunity to play h into g3, f into g3, knight to a2 because of that a2 rook. Because now after takes and knight c1, it's a fork, right? But it's not the best continuation because here white has rook to f3. Very tricky idea. Probably Gukesh saw this. That's why he played rook to a2. And at this particular position, the d6 pawn is hanging, knight c4, knight d6 comes next. And this is some type of compensation for white, but it's not enough. Still, it is some type of compensation for white. But Magnus, being Magnus, did not care at all about any of the threats that Gukesh is creating. Let king to g7. Beautiful move again. Just calculated everything out that at the end of the variation there is rook f3 to attack the knight, and now the knight is defended. So now it's a threat again. So rook to a7, getting out of that knight to c1 fork at the end of the game. So, and again, Magnus finds another nice move. The only problem you have is after hg3, fg3, the knight is hanging and the bishop is hanging, right? So Magnus just played rook to d4, defending the bishop, and now h into g3 is on the cards because after f into g, the rook is not attacking the bishop anymore because it is defended. But it does allow knight to f3, which was played instantly by Gukesh. And Magnus already had calculated everything out. He played h into g3, f into g3, because if you play take knight into d4, then I can simply play a into d4 and you can resign in this position. F into g3, attacking the knight, attacking the rook, attacking the bishop. But here Magnus missed something. Magnus played knight into h3, but there is a winning continuation here. But you have to look little bit deeper. And Magnus just played knight into h3 in 1 minute. So pause the video for third time and find the winning continuation for black in this position. Okay, the move is bishop into e4, simply getting the bishop out of the harm's way so that I'm moving the knight next move. So you have to capture the knight, and this is the idea. Rook to d1 check, and the problem is you cannot defend with rook to e1 because bishop into f3 removes the defender of the rook while defending my own rook. So I'm gonna be piece up. And other than that, if you play king to h2, then after a into f4, the rook is trapped because if you move the rook, let's say c2, e2 does not matter. There is knight g4 check. After h into g4, rook h8, it's gonna be checkmate. After knight h4, rook h4. Well, yes. So, well, you can play rook to h3 now, but I mean, you still lost a lot of things. So that is winning for black. That is something which wins on the spot for black. But Magnus played knight into h3, a natural move, a human move. It's move number 33. It makes sense. They don't have much time to calculate anymore. G into h3, bishop into e4. Still winning for Magnus. Pass d pawn decides the game. Sorry. King to h2. Of course, you don't want to keep your knight under the pin. And again, excellent move by Magnus. The idea of king to h2 is that white wants to play knight to g5, gain some counterplay on that f7 pawn. And here Magnus played rook to d1, which paralyzes this knight because rook to h1 is gonna be checkmate if you move the knight. And Gukesh played g4 to open the king's square. So knight g5 is again a threat. And again, Magnus had a winning move in this position, which stops knight g5 directly also. So, but he didn't play it. He played bishop into d5, which is good enough. But rook h8 would have forced the resignation here. Well, let's say king to g3, then bishop into f3, and there is no good defense against this. You have to play rook takes, and then knight e4 check, and you are getting destroyed. The knight defends f7, attacks rook, attacks pawn. That's about it. That's the game. And well, that's about it. So rook h8 wins on the spot after g4, but Magnus played bishop into d5, which Stops knight g5 because there is no threats on f7. I will just move my bishop, take on b3, let's say, and that's it. So bishop into d5, knight into d5, and now knight g5 loses the rook. So that's something you have to defend the rook. Knight f4 attacks the rook again. Rook to c2. By the way, here onwards, Gukesh start playing the perfect engine moves for like next 30 moves, and that's why he won this game. Rook to c2. Again, hoping that knight g5 lands on the board. It's a move number 39. Magnus has to play two more moves to reach the Rhyme control. He played king to f6. Again, if you play e4 like some silly move, the knight g5 is an instant draw. And here you have to play something like rook to f8 and rook to f2. And I would say black is very lucky to have a draw after e3. Otherwise, he would lose. So Magnus played king to f6 to stop knight g5 idea, and h4 by Gukesh, reintroducing the knight g5 idea because pawn defends it, right? And it is move number 40, the last move before the time control, and you have to stop knight to g5. So pause the video and try to find the instant kill move in this position, which Magnus missed again for the third time in this game. Yeah. So the move is again rook to h8. It's like a kryptonite for Magnus. He just didn't find rook to h8 for a long time now. And again, knight g5 is impossible because h4 pawn hangs with check followed by the knight. And that's about it. You cannot do much here. The h4 pawn is defended by the knight only. So you have to do something. And meanwhile, I will just start pushing my pawns forward. So that's gonna be just winning. But Magnus played king to e6, which I would say is a slight inaccuracy. It gives, well, sorry about that. It's actually a big inaccuracy. After this move, I think the engine shows that the position is just equal. Because now there comes knight to g5 check, king to d5, and as the king lacks any square at all, you are not gonna take on f7, of course. You're gonna go after the king hunt. Rook to a5 check, king to d4, and rook to a4 check, king to e3, sorry, d3, and again the rook is under attack, so rook to f2 with a very deadly threat of rook to f3 check followed by rook to a2 check. And Magnus found a way, well, the f7 pawn is also hanging, so Magnus found the only move which, well, probably going to lose the game for him. It is still gonna be equal, but it gives white a huge attack. Here, the move you have to find one more time is rook to h8 because, well, if you play rook f3, king c2, rook a2, king b1, the king is perfectly fine on b1 square. And the problem is if you play rook f2 f2 with some, well, back rank, sorry, rook b2 idea, then knight e3, and bye bye all the ideas that white has. And the h4 is hanging simply. So that is a catastrophe. So that is just resigns. Again, rook to h8, the move Magnus misses for fourth time in the game. But Magnus played f6, and that's the mistake. That's the last mistake that Magnus has before he had the advantage. Now his all advantage is gone, and now it's Gukesh who is going to push for the win here. He played rook to f3 check, king to e2, and here again, I mean, they do not gain a lot of time after move 40. They just gain the increment on moves. And here Gukesh should have played rook to e4 check, and after king d2 played rook to a4. The idea being if you play rook to a2, which Gukesh played, then there is rook d2. If you play rook to e4 check first, and then you play rook to a4 followed by rook to a2, then there is no rook d2 because there is a king sitting on d2. So you have to play king to e2 back, then I go rook to e4 back, and it's an instant repetition of moves and a draw. But of course, it's inhuman. So Gukesh plays rook to a2 check with basically no thinking at all. Rook d2, rook takes, king takes, and knight to e4. So this was the position Gukesh had in mind when it's a check, king e2 and king g3, and suddenly the two pawns of black is hanging. So Gukesh is going to win his pawn back, and now his position does not look that bad anymore. It is holdable, and with best defense, it is just draw. d5 by Magnus. Right continuation, of course, d5, d pawn is more valuable than f pawn. Knight into f6, and Here, the only defense which you can rely on is rook to d8. This is the only move which you gives you some hope to, gain some complications, even though it is still gonna be a draw. But Magnus plays the last inaccuracy, rook to f8. I'm gonna show you what happens after rook d8 for brief movement. Rook to f2 check, which was played in the game as well. King to e1, and this is the idea. Pawn to g5. This is inhuman. If white finds this, then, well, white deserves all the things he is going to get. Because let's say you play pawn to d4. Then the idea is after king f3, pawn d3, there is inhuman rook to h2 when you cannot play d2 because rook h1 checkmate. And suddenly this king finds itself in a very awkward position. King to e3 is the next move. So again, a very inhuman type of idea, but it works. And this is the only way to draw the game. So rook d8, it is very hard to find the draw with rook f2, king f3, rook h2 idea. So maybe Magnus could have played that. But rook to f8 just blunders the game away. And Gukesh finds the right move, which is starts with rook f2 check, king to e1, and nice fork with knight to d7. Probably, I don't know what Magnus missed here. Maybe he missed knight e2. Well, he played knight e2 check, but he missed that after rook e8, knight into e5. And if he plays knight e2 check now, then do you see the draw here? Yes, rook into e2. And after king e2 and king f4, it is a draw because your d pawn will march forward and I will capture it, while my h pawn moves forward and I will capture your rook for that pawn. So it's gonna be a draw at the end of the day. So that is what you should have played. I mean, that is a draw, but still black is pushing. But Magnus plays knight to e2, which is a huge blunder. So, well, pause the video and try to find what Gukesh played for the fourth time in this video. Yeah, so your rook is under attack, of course. So you just remove the defender of the check and then you capture the rook. So Gukesh is suddenly a knight up, but probably Magnus have thought of it. Played d4, knight e6, d3, knight c5, and king to e3, and it suddenly looks like, well, if you had played d2, then knight e4, and it wins because pawn promotes, then there is knight c3 check, which wins the queen. So the knight is very tricky. Of course, Magnus saw that and he played king to, well, after knight c5, he played king to e3, stopping knight to e4, and probably this is the move which Magnus missed, and this is the only move which wins for white. All the other moves loses. So pause the video for the fifth time and become the endgame expert and beat the Magnus while I give you a couple of seconds. Yeah, the move is knight to a4, going away from the pawn because this b2 and the c3 are the main squares you are aiming for. And well, Magnus played e4. There is no other ways to continue. And after h5, gh5, gh5, and well, he played king d2. This just no way. There's no other moves. Knight to b2, pawn to e3, and again there is only one move which wins for white. All the other move loses. So for the sixth time and the last time in this entire video, pause the video and try to find the winning continuation for white. Yep, knight to c4 check, the only move which wins. And after king to e2, there comes king to f4, and it was in this position at move number 62 that Magnus Carlsen resigns the game because he is just losing this pawn, then this square will be covered and these pawns are going to queen. So very nice defense and very nice comeback by Gukesh in this game. Let me just show you the very small clip after Magnus resigned. So yeah, here's the clip. Here Gukesh just played knight f c4 and king to f4, and you can see that Magnus reaction. And yeah, I mean it happens. It's chess. It happens. So yeah, that's the game. It is not easy to win. Well, Gukesh was very resilient. He played the best moves after best move after best move, and Magnus keep on missing that rook h8 particular one move idea. Sometimes chess players have this particular blackout in particular move where they just don't see that move, right? And that's the only move. Well, rook h8 is the only move which appeared like 4 times, and all 4 times it would win, but Magnus didn't play it. And at the end of the day, it was well, it was one sided. It's not like it was three result game at the end, and Gukesh was able to pull it off with some brilliant defense. So we have to give it to Gukesh. He played brilliant chess after getting outplayed by Magnus for the entire game. So yeah, that's the game. Now I think you have the good understanding of why we praise Gukesh for this particular defense and why Magnus is so frustrated. So yeah, I think well, we have something to learn from this game to keep resisting. All right, guys. So I will see you on the next one. Bye.